So my question was, what was it that I guess our leaders saw in integration that you mentioned no other ethnic group wants to integrate but us? Why?
Well, the mere fact is that when Nixon came into office in 1968, one of the first things he did was make a promise and a commitment to the majority of society, and particularly the conservative elements in the society, that he would put an end to the whole civil rights movement and the black power movement in this country. And Monahan at that time, Daniel Monahan, sent a memo to him saying basically child policy called benign neglect. Benign neglect. In the Daniel Monahan memo, which says, take the focus off of black folk and shift it to other groups, to women, children, and immigrants, and pretend that black folk don't exist. Make them invisible in the society. So public policies went out all over the country, basically saying, don't ignore black folk. Don't include them in anything of any substance and consequence. And based on a couple of Supreme Court rulings by 1978, they came to this whole concept called diversity. Diversity meant divert resources away from black folk and give it to other groups. And so at that time, all these other groups started popping up. Then the women's movement jumped up and started moving forward. And some of it also, and the initial emphasis also came from the Kennedy administration that suggested that you had to take the whole civil rights movement and integrate it, and bring in women and white youth and the unions into the fact to dilute it and water it down. Integration is a watering down process. It's a dilution process. And somehow, I don't know why my leaders and my friends in the politics don't understand that. You cannot strengthen anything and make it stronger by integrating it. You don't integrate. You put water in the gasoline. You're not making the gasoline any more powerful, more potent. You're watering it down. And what integration and social integration has done for black folk, Carl, it just simply made them a guest. It made them a guest in what other people own and control in a competitive society. You're living in a society called America. It is a capitalistic-based society, which means you're working to compete with other groups. Nobody's coming to America to get along with you, to be your friend, your partner, the people of color. They come in here to compete and get as much as they can in terms of unearned benefits. And black folk don't seem to understand that, so while they're out there busy integrating, these other groups going to come in, they're going to take over all these major urban cities, and they're going to dominate them. And that's why from New York to Washington, D.C., no longer a chocolate city. And then Detroit and Michigan going to go down. In Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Gary, and Los Angeles is going already. And in Florida, South Florida, where you are, at one time, we had a lot of major black areas down there. You had Overtowns, you had Liberty City, you had Coconut Grove. Those things have been integrated out of existence.
So what is the plan? Can this be reversed? What do we do? Move back to the inner cities?
Well, you have to see the first thing black folk have to understand, it ain't about hating or disliking anybody. It's about competition. And somehow black folks think that if you're against integration, you hate somebody. It ain't about hating anybody. Everybody else is busy engaging in activities that take care of their own people. I don't ever blame whites for what they do. Whites did exactly what they're supposed to do. They take care of their people. So do the Indians and the Asians, the Chinese and the Arabs. They take care of their people. It's only our people, our black leadership, that totally ignore their own people. And back when that public policy of benign neglect went into effect, and they're going to take the focus off of black folk, most of our black leadership at that time, particularly civil rights leaders, they gave into the realities of racism and say, well, if we're going to never be able to do anything for black folk anymore, we might as well start getting close to the white corporate dollars and start taking care of it and join with these other groups. And they began to sign agreements with them. They signed public agreements, those groups, to do nothing unless they included them with whatever they're going to do for black folk. When I was out in California, as you know, out in Inglewood, I went to the city council there to try to build a hotel for blacks over there in Inglewood. And two women, two Hispanic women and one white woman got up ahead of me before the city council say, Mr. Mayor, we're upset because Dr. Evans would come here to do something for black folk and not including us. And the Martinez, the guy that sat on the city council, he said, Dr. Evans, before you address that issue, that concern, you need to know in California, we've signed, the civil rights groups have signed agreements with us not to do anything without include Hispanics in it. And then now how are you going to react to that? Now, if you look at my business card, it doesn't say anything about integration, it doesn't say anything about civil rights. I said, the only ism I'm into is our ism, blackism right now. I'm trying to support those people that nobody care about. It's totally indifferent. The ones that everybody's been told to ignore and forget that they don't exist. I fight for black folk, not because I hate anybody else. I come from a mixed family, but I'm still going to fight for black folk because nobody gives a darn. They have no leadership. They've been abandoned by their own people and moved into the social integration bit. And black folk had, Carl, they had more in the 1950s than they got today. Black folk used to have communities. They used to own and control resources, communities, churches, buildings, schools. They had laundries and mats. They had their own hotels and railroad systems. They had bus lines, cab companies, and theaters. They own nothing now because integration took it all from them. Integration will strip you down to nothing. You can't compete. That's why you're a permanent underclass.
Well, Doc, quickly, Earl just tweeted, he got a question for you. He says he wants to know more details about these so-called deals that you mentioned that our civil rights leaders have signed with other groups.
Well, I'll have pull up some of the papers, but you go check with groups like the Council of La Raza, Council of LULAC, check with the Mexican Defense League, check with the National Hispanic Party, those groups, okay?
This is actually a document that's signed by our.
They've agreed. The leaders have agreed. That's why you're not going to find any black leaders with any notoriety in this society, that would stand up and identifiably speak for something that would benefit strictly and solely black folk. What they want to do now is pretend that somehow that black folk are no different from any other group in this country. That our experience as black folk in America is just identical to any Hispanic that ran across the border last night. That there's no difference between a Hispanic, an Arab, an Indian, anybody else in this country. They've all been treated the same. As a matter of fact, they want you to believe there's no difference between a gay and a black person. But black people have a very unique history in this country, a very specialness. They have a special relationship with this country that's been going on for 500 years. They have problems that are uniquely their own, that does not relate to any other group. And yet nobody wants to address those issues. That's why you got major problems in this country, never going to resolve them. Because nobody wants to look at the problems of black folk. And integration took our people the wrong way. The problem was when the integration came about, was that they never looked down the road and said, what was the real problem for black folk during slavery and Jim Crow segregation? It was a maldistribution of all the wealth, resource, privileges, and controls of all levels of government in the society into the hands of the dominant white society. Black folk owned 1/2 of 1% of anything of value. Here you are 140 years later, you still own 1/2 of 1% of anything in value. You don't own or control anything. You can't employ your own people. You don't even control your school system. I heard y'all talking about a few minutes ago. You're going to control them because they're no longer within your communities. Then now you're now putting these black kids on buses and send them all to some other people's neighborhoods and to their schools. And I'll tell you about them. You was talking about education. I'm the only black that's ever over the entire education system for a state from 1970 to 1976 with this whole concept of charter schools and public and religious schools and religious academies cropped up. And because these individuals are trying to avoid integration, that's why they created those schools, to bust the public school system that was initially put in place in the 1860s to begin to educate all these black kids coming out of slavery with their parents.
800-450-7876 to speak to Dr. Anderson. Let's go to line 1. Fred's in D.C. Fred, you're on with Dr. Anderson.
Oh, good evening to both of you. Dr. Anderson, I always love hearing you. Everything you say I agree with. Let me ask you a question.
You're a good man. I love you.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Before integration, when we owned businesses, when our community was more cohesive, and we had so much going on, we owned land and everything, how much did we rely on politics?
At that time, very little. Yes, as a matter of fact, if you would go back to 1920 as an example, at that time, in comparative terms with 100,000 people, black people had 20 times more businesses in 1920 than you got today. But when the Great Depression came along, and it wiped out most of the business in the United States, it wiped out black businesses too, destroyed a lot of them. But in 1920, we had bus companies, we had mattress companies, we had a shipyard in Baltimore, we had a railroad line in Jacksonville, Florida, another railroad line in Little Rock, Arkansas. We had our own bus companies in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, with over 500 buses. We had our own movie theater chains, 3 movie theater chains across America, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters, and so on. I'm telling you. And but what happened was that when the economy went down, and they started recovering in the late 1930s, you got 3 groups that got upset because they felt that we had too much blackness at that particular time. W.B. Du Bois, starting about 1915, was pushing black politics. Marcus Garvey at that time was pushing black economics. Carter G. Woodson was pushing black education and black culture. Elijah Muhammad started pushing black religion. And the black artists and entertainers were pushing the Renaissance group and black culture and the art and entertainment. But by the late 1930s, the triad got together. That was your black ministers, your black civil rights leaders, and your black newspapers. They said there's too much blackness. And rather than rebuilding in the 1930s, rebuilding all these businesses and industries stuff we had, they said let's just stay out of it now and let other people come in our community and build businesses. And they say, well, we're going to do it
right there, Doc, because we're going to take a break. And also, when you come back and when you answer the question about the Harlem Renaissance, because some people have said that was designed to kill the Back to Africa movement by Marcus Garvey, and also to kill the black nationalist thrust that was going on at that same time.
About what happened in the late 1930s. And see, after blacks had lost a lot of their investments because of the Great Depression, a lot of them were totally unwilling by the end of the 1930s, they're unwilling to go back and rebuild all these businesses again. They felt it might be better, under the persuasion of our black leadership at that time, to just open up our communities at that time, let other people come in and establish businesses and just give us jobs. And some of the Jewish people were very effective in doing this. They came in and said, we'll help you. What is it you want? And at that time, the leadership started pushing for social integration. And the Jews at that time were coming into the country in the early 1900s. They were looking for money and businesses to start. And so they said, well, we'll join with you all to help you start these businesses if you just support us and what we want to get in the country. So let us come in your community. So Jews went into most of these communities, set up these businesses, and they did very well. And they pushed for blacks into socialism, trying to get social integration. And but by the early 1940s, to make a long story short, at that time, universality which means get along with all people and don't be focused on your own selves first. It became social integration at that point. And when they started becoming social integration in the 1940s, the Jews and blacks became very effective in trying to push for social integration. But the other groups in the society, they felt that was a threat to them, and they began to get rid of integration. All the Polish communities and Irish communities, they began to come together. Said, we have to band together. If these blacks are going to come in and penetrate us, let's band back together. So all the ethnic white communities started disappearing. And so they come together and aggregate and just be one large white community, while black folks was trying to integrate. And the first thing they tried to integrate was the baseball teams. Jackie Robinson, they said, Brooke Rickey said, if I can get this one black baseball player to play with the Brooklyn Dodgers, we don't need all the rest of these black teams. We had two black leagues, black baseball leagues at that time, with about 450 some black baseball players. They were like the best in the world, couldn't beat them. But they got rid of all the teams and all those black players just to put one black boy on the Brooklyn Dodgers team. Same thing happened with basketball. Blacks are the best basketball players. They couldn't beat them. But yet they took a few of those and put them on the white teams and let the rest of them go and converted some of them over with Abe Saperstein and called the Harlem Globetrotters. Then they went to the black universities. They did the same thing. They said, if we can just get one black kid to go to a white university, we'll get rid of our schools, our black colleges, and run the money into those schools. Now, see, no other people would do that. Catholics would not give up the Catholic University or Notre Dame just so Catholics can go sit in a Protestant school. Jewish would not give up Brandeis University just so they can go sit in a Catholic school. Only black folks say, we let our colleges and universities go down under integration if we just get our kids to go to a white school. And so everything began to fall apart, all the way up through the civil rights movement, to make a long story short.
So why is that, though? Because you mentioned, it seems like our leaders are leading us down this integration path. Yet now you have Latinos or Hispanics, whatever the PC term to use for that group, and yet are they on the onslaught like we were now, or are they just being left alone and everybody's picking on us? No, they're going to go. They're going to always go after the weakest link in the chain. And see, nobody's going to come to rescue you. You have never seen, and I doubt it's highly unlikely you will ever see any marches. You will never see American Indians coming off the reservation. You ever seen any American Indians trying to integrate? They're not going to come off the reservation, go and say, we're going to march on Washington to help poor black folk, to do this for black folk. Koreans not come out, and Asians not come out in the streets and say, we're going to come out here and forget and ignore our needs and go out here and fight for black folk. Nobody's going to do that. You haven't seen a march by women ever do anything for black folk. The women issue only crops up every time there's some demand for something for black folk. The same thing that happened during the Reconstruction period, when they tried to give black folk the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. The women's movement jumped up and said, you can't give it to the blacks until you give it to us. And that same thing happened in the 1960s when black folk were trying to get some additional civil rights benefits. And a senator from Louisiana and a congressman from Virginia says, before you give black folk all those rights, we got to take care of the white woman. They turned around and put in Title IX. Title IX was to divert the resources away from black folk. I did a survey in Florida when I was over education for the state of Florida during those years to find out what happened to the desegregation funds that's been coming to Florida. I surveyed 67 counties, county systems, to find out what happened to the monies.
And out of all the desegregation funds that were coming down, so they directed towards blacks in the state of Florida during the desegregation period, the money went to title. All of them said, we'd rather spend our money on Title IX for women than spend it on black people. And black folk have never gotten the message.